Hi, I'm Kimberly Gladden, Director of Discipleship, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on discipleship in a multi-ethnic context. I'm excited about our conversation today because we're sharing cyberspace in two different countries on two different days at the same time. So, good morning, good Wednesday morning to those in New Zealand, and good afternoon Tuesday to those who are in the U.S. We've got a great conversation today. We're going to discuss some of the things we face as we try to disciple across cultures. We're also going to be streaming live on Facebook, YouTube. So if you'd like to enter the conversation, we have a chat room on YouTube. Ask questions, offer comments. It'd be great to have folks from both sides of the water, New Zealand and U.S., in the chat room and joining us there in the chat room on YouTube. I'm joined today by my co-host, the Reverend Daniel Walker, and I'm glad to welcome Dan here from the U.S. He is an ordained minister in the Wesleyan Church, and Dan has a heart for some of the same issues that I do. We're working on some social holiness projects together, and I invited him to sit in. Thank you, Dan.
It's great to be here, Kim. Thanks.
Great, great. We're also joined by Reverend Brett Jones, Assistant National Superintendent of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in New Zealand. And in addition to pastoring Session Community Church there, Brett's also responsible at a national level for church development. So welcome, Brett.
Good morning and good afternoon.
Yes, good morning and afternoon. I want to begin our conversation with this quote from Soon Cheng Ra from his book, Many Colors, Cultural Intelligence for a Changing Church. And here's what he states. Your church has a culture. If you are aware of it, you probably are in the minority. If you're not aware of it, the culture is probably yours. And when we begin to deal with a wider range of diversity, we enter into another level of complexity. Cultural complexity, therefore, challenges us to think on multiple levels of conscious. How do we handle holding seemingly disparate values in a dynamic tension? So, Brett, I thought we'd begin the conversation just by asking you to lay the groundwork for us. When we think of the culture of New Zealand, what are we talking about when we talk about just the general culture first of New Zealand?
Thanks, Kim. Well, for a start, New Zealand is a relatively recently settled country. So settlement in terms of Pacific expansion has only been across the last 1,000 years. And then in terms of European expansion in the 1800s. And so still a really young country. We have a significant percentage of Indigenous people, about 15% of the population are Māori, and have been here for many hundreds of years. And then the initial thrust of immigration was from Britain, so significant cultural inheritance from that part of the world, and most of our institutions of government and so on reflect that. But then really from really the 60s onwards, we've experienced a great deal of diversity, initially from the Pacific Islands, so from Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, and other islands of the Pacific. And then in the 80s and 90s, significant immigration from Southeast Asia. And that has really, those factors together really transformed the cultural landscape. And so we now have a genuinely multi-ethnic society, where in some parts of New Zealand, the population born overseas is fast going past the population born here. So quite diverse, particularly in the big cities. But also the timing of New Zealand's settlement in terms of European expansion also means that the missionary ripple that hit New Zealand and what followed, I think, has set us up to be a more secular country than many countries that were settled earlier than us. So secularism is quite a strong part of the culture. And that definitely is part of the landscape. At the same time, we do benefit from some of the immigration in that many of those people bring faith worldviews, some Christian, and that does tend to season the overall sense of the place of religion and faith in society. So we're a little bit ambiguous on the issue of secularism. There are deep pockets of secularism, and then there are those that are really seasoned by immigrant peoples who bring faith, including Christian faith.
Brett, with all of those things contributing to the culture, what do you see in our churches there, in the Wesleyan Methodist Church? What would we see in terms of cultural diversity, or who's in the church? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are really three categories I think that are useful. I mean, they're not. It's a complex situation, but there are three ways to think about it. Now, first up, we have what we might call monoethnic churches, and so they are churches that could be largely English speaking and reasonably European oriented. Although those are increasingly fewer in number, simply because immigration makes that almost impossible these days. Or they could be immigrant churches. So in the Wesleyan Church, for example, we have Tongan language churches, Fijian language churches, Rotuman language churches that are largely people, first generation immigrants from those countries and their children and
Well,
grandchildren. And so their services are conducted in the language of home. And so that would be the first group. The second group are those multicultural churches that are sort of multicultural by accident, not really by design. So those are churches that are simply learning to reflect their community, and sometimes that community has gone through significant change. For example, in the area that I live in, the level of Asian immigration has changed the population to the point where 30% of the population are of Southeast Asian or Chinese origin, which is quite a significant shift in the population in what was one of the earliest settled areas. The third area for us are those churches that are self-consciously not just multi-ethnic, but are self-consciously multicultural and are asking the questions about what it's going to look like for a multicultural church to intentionally occupy a significant space in the community, not simply because we want to solve a problem of diversity in the church, but because we want the church to be a vehicle of mission to a really diverse community. And so we're kind of making some steps forward in some of those areas, learning as we go, and some stories that we would say that helps us see what the future could look like. Others where we go, well, we probably won't do that again.
Brett, we wanted to have this conversation because here in the States, we're also dealing with this whole concept of how do you disciple across a multi-ethnic context. And we know that while there's some things that are the same, there's some things that are different. But we wanted to have this conversation so that you could share from your journey there in New Zealand. And as you mentioned those three types of congregations, is there any sense of what kind of numbers we might be looking at? Would is it one third, one third, one third, or what might be some of the numbers?
Yeah, so we have 28 churches in the movement here. Over half of, or about half of them are monoethnic plants that reflect immigrant peoples. About a third would be traditional, originally European churches that speak English, and that whose paradigm is largely Western European in the way they think about worship, but are being influenced by an increasingly multicultural community around them. And then the minority of our churches would be those that are learning to be intentionally multicultural and are perhaps even been planted with that in mind.
that's great, Brett. And when you talk from the national perspective, it seems that multiracial church family is something that you all celebrate and are really excited about. Can you speak from the national level real quick about kind of what is the perspective of the multi-ethnicity of the movement as a whole within New Zealand?
Yeah, well, I mean, our commitment and our really a conviction of ours is that multi-ethnic, multicultural New Zealand can only be reached by a multicultural church. So it's a no-brainer for mission. Now, how you then enact that, with all of the lenses and biases, and which that quote beautifully captures, Kim, how you enact that, I think, is a much longer journey. Some of the ways that we try to do it in our national council, which is would be the equivalent of General Board of Administration, we actually direct the conference in its discernment process to think about not just the lay clergy, male female issue, but we actually direct them to issues of multi-ethnic. Representation is the wrong word, because we're not asking people to represent their community. We're asking their community to participate in the life of the church, and I think that's different. I'm happy to be led by a Fijian person as much as I'm happy to be led by a Tongan person. I'm not asking them simply to lead their own section of the church. and so that at the structural level, we do our best. I think there's room for us to grow in that area. In our when we gather as a church, as we will this weekend, our national conferences this weekend, again, we try to involve and engage across the cultures, particularly in how we think about worship. While we do largely share a common language in that a majority of people are able to speak English. For many, it's a second language. But there's also just the diversity, and there's joy in that diversity of learning and sharing from each other's cultures. So in our opening rally on Friday night, for example, there will be multiple languages spoken, cultural forms that will be expressed as part of the worship service. And our speaker for that night is a Rotuman Fijian. So, it's very much a part of who we are to express that.
That's great.
Brett, when you talk about that, just coming to that worship service for a moment, can you expand on that when you say multiple forms? I mean, how does that look like? Because I know sometimes here in the States, Dan, you probably know this too, that there's this kind of this tension of how do we include others without it being kind of like we're putting all these showcasing or tokenism or
yes.
how tell us a little bit, walk us through how you try to do that and how you'll do that this weekend at that conference.
I think that's a real issue, and at times some of our services have looked like some kind of weird cultural talent show, and it's really the last thing, cultural idol, it's really the last thing we want, is that kind of I think it's demeaning to everybody. So for example, some of the cultural forms that exist lend themselves wonderfully to different aspects of worship. For example, in the Fijian culture, they have a cultural form called a thimbi, which is a bit like the New Zealand haka. It's a war dance. Now, when you think about how that fits into Christian culture, it sits really well in terms of declaration of truth, in terms of spiritual warfare, in terms of some aspects of praise. So what a great way to kick off a worship service where someone is making this strong declaration using a dance form that also includes spoken or chanted language that culturally and spiritually syncs really well into the journey of worship that you're going on together. I wouldn't use that as you guys use the term special music, which we think is a bit odd. I wouldn't use that as a special music element after the message. Probably it might just be a little bit of a misfit. But so thinking about, for example, how that can work, we have a Tongan choir who work very with a great deal of discipline and practice, who are actually going to be in our worship space as people arrive, just singing Tongan hymns, which for them is in their own language, but also carries with it aspects of missionary culture that was a part of their own receiving of the gospel 200 years ago. So there's a mixed cultural expression that they bring. So yeah, we try to look at how the whole fits together, and what is the journey of worship that we're on together, and then how can we contribute to that, rather than the showcase idea, which I think leaves everyone feeling a little bit poorer because, well, we just watched something, we didn't participate.
I think you're right. I'm reminded of a workshop that I attended on introducing multi-ethnic music, and it talked about doing it with integrity, and that it's a natural part of the celebration, not just a Frankenstein where we chop and put things in. So I think you're right.
We try to make sure language is used as well. So prayers, readings, any opportunity. Particularly, technology allows that to be a very inclusive process. Someone can read the scripture in Tongan, it can be on the screen in English. It's just a part of for some people, they get to hear the gospel in language that reminds them of home, language that speaks to their heart. And that moment, I might have to read it on the screen. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, and so that's one of the ways that you overcome the language difficulties. Can you share a little more? You mentioned before that most people do have some capacity to understand or speak English. Are there some obstacles that you face in bringing so many different and diverse groups together? and how do you overcome those?
Well, I think first English, the level of English is different depending on the individual, and in some cases, for example, some of the Pacific Islands, for example, have a stronger heritage of English because they were British colonies originally. Some were German, some were French, and so there's a stronger inheritance of English, and so there'll be a different level of English ability. Certainly, some of the older members of families often really struggle with English and don't have much at all. So it's very difficult for us with our resources to offer translation services across that diversity. Really
I
difficult.
can only imagine.
We do try to accommodate some of the things that you can do, even if it's even translating English onto PowerPoints. So it's still English, but it's at least in a written form that allows people to track a little better. We've done a few things. Like we've got one gentleman who's just translated our entire discipline into Tongan.
Wow.
Which must have been a mammoth exercise, even if ours is about a tenth of the size of yours. And so little things like that, I think, but that's him owning it. I can't translate it into Tongan. So those are difficulties. I think there are also challenges around. It's not just about language; it's also about how different cultures, what signals they send, how they want to discuss things, how they want to make decisions. There's a whole range of things where you just completely miss each other. I was talking with one of my Fijian friends who pastors one of our multicultural churches, wanted to just chat to him ahead of today, and we talked about the issue of lateness, for example. So if a Pacific person is late for a meeting, the pastor will hold the meeting until they arrive because he or she wants to care and offer care to the whole group who'll be there. Whereas I'm more inclined to want to care for those who've made it on time. Those are profoundly different worldviews.
They are.
And there's a lot that we can learn from each other in that. But without discussing that, without talking about that, without acknowledging that, we just completely miss. And I could, for example, experience lateness as disrespect, which would be the last thing on people's minds. Just as people who arrived on time could feel waiting as disrespect if they were from my culture. In my friend's culture, it would be highly rude to proceed without everybody there. So lots to learn and lots to understand, and not understanding and not talking about it is one of those barriers that I think has to be worked through.
And Brett, with that, how have you handled that on the national level? Have you tried to do education across that since you have so many different ethnicities? Or is it something that culturally, because so many people are together, you see a mutuality of understanding within the community? How have you handled that?
I would say that, we've stumbled into understanding more than we have, had a really clear sense of it. And I think at times we've done it badly. I think we still do it poorly in many cases. I think we're very lucky in that we have some people in our church who operate really as bridge people for the rest of us and help us understand. And I think the church needs, to acknowledge and allow people like that to really speak into the context, because you don't know what you don't know. And that's the real challenge in all of this. So I'd like to think we had a multicultural task force that was, providing strong educational materials for the whole church. But we don't. We're just kind of learning it as we go and trying to learn to listen better.
So it really required grace from all ends. And then from that,
probably particularly from the minority and more than the majority culture, I think we're given a lot more grace than we.
Brett, when I'm just thinking about this whole thing of cultures being together and that whole thing when you mentioned lateness. I know that in some cultures we'll begin the meeting when it begins. It's not a big deal if it doesn't begin at exactly on the hour, and how others experience that as rudeness. But I'm just thinking in terms of when you talked about the number of cultures there in New Zealand, Would some of them be coming from a more oral tradition versus a Western written tradition? And when you come to planning discipleship programs, have you seen that difference in culture have an impact on how you plan or how you execute the discipleship programs?
Yeah, so for us, as a national movement, what we really, and this is just part of how we set up the church. I mean, we've only been going for 17 years. We had the opportunity to do a blueprint from nothing, and one of the things we've had to do is manage. To what extent does local autonomy inform how a church approaches things versus what the national emphases might be? And so what we really encourage churches to do is to express those kinds of things in their own context. So for example, at this conference, I'm launching a discipleship pathways or continuing the launch of a discipleship pathways paradigm that is really about each church knowing how it is planning for people to be discipled, from new believers through to mature believers. What we're not doing is telling them what should be in that strategy, in the sense of you need to do it like this. Instead, we're crafting it and saying, here are some principles that operate across cultures. Here are some questions that every church needs to be able to answer. Now, how you answer them will take into account those very issues, whether it is more an oral culture, a written culture, more communal, etc. And so really trying to give the churches the tools to assess and analyze their own context, and then we can try and support them with what they need. But also, I think, pointing out some of the blind spots that generally exist in the different parts of the church, and kind of acknowledging that we all have, I guess you call them almost cultural idols, that are hindrances to discipleship, as much as we also have cultural inheritances, which are, make discipleship richer for us in our different expressions.
Maybe let's talk about some of those. Do you have maybe an example you could give us? Because I think this
Yeah.
this transcends. We all have some cultural idols, and maybe a specific example might be good.
Yeah, and I think, and this is very broad, and my New Zealand New Zealand viewers, would probably want to dig into this with a bit more detail. But in a very broad sense, for example, the Western European mindset is more knowledge oriented, and knowledge is prized, and knowledge is valued. Well, that then translates into a certain kind of discipleship activity, which might do a lot to inform us, but how much does it do to transform us? And so the cultural idol of knowledge is a rich inheritance, because it certainly resources the church. But when it becomes an idol and actually becomes a barrier to genuine transformation, then I think we've got a problem. So, for example, in our churches that would identify with that paradigm, we've really got to challenge them to say, well, for example, in small group ministry, why are you going to do a whole third curriculum? You've already got the curriculum from Sunday, which no one's actually applied. You've already got the devotional curriculum, which we hope you're doing, which, by the way, no one's done. And yet, here, coming to the small group, we're going to introduce a third curriculum because we're so obsessed with knowledge and feed me. And what if we just said, look, how about every time we gather, we're going to ask what the Spirit is saying to us on Sunday in our devotional life? Interesting to see what that does to how people then try to appropriate the knowledge that they get on Sunday. It's changing the way that they are thinking about the application of that. A similar way in some of our cultures where they're more communal in orientation, there is a certain cultural default towards uniformity of behaviour. So the communal paradigm, one of the outcomes is that people would act in the best interests of the whole. And so there are certain cultural expectations about what that looks like. Well, when you translate that into Christianity, when that becomes distorted, then you can easily end up with a kind of a behavior performance-based discipleship. Discipleship looks like doing things the right way rather than doing things out of the right heart. And so that's a potential cultural blind spot for communal cultures. And so their challenge is not so much to the idolatry of the head, but can culture itself become an idol? the way we do things, and certainly in conversations with younger generations, they really struggle with an inability to be authentic in those environments, because authenticity would lead to I'm not actually doing what my parents expect me to do, because which takes us to the third category, which is our third culture. So children of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants, and we think of this idea of third culture or cross culture because they draw significant parts of their identity from their family of origin, but they draw significant parts of their identity from the prevailing culture around them. That's where their schooling takes place. That's where they work. And yet, many would say that they don't feel completely at home in their culture of origin, and they don't feel completely at home in the prevailing culture. So we think of them as this third culture. And some of the research suggests that, say, a third culture Tongan or a third culture Chinese person actually have more in common with each other culturally than either of them do with their families or their prevailing culture, because their primary experience has been one of cultural confusion, identity formation, that is, and trying to navigate culture. That's actually their primary cultural experience, is that whole navigation. So when they sit down together, they suddenly discover that they have all of this commonality of experience around that journeying. So those are some very profound issues for them, and I sense that one of the challenges for that group is the issue of identity formation, and in particular the discipleship issue was, well, what does it look like for me to discover what identity in Christ looks like, and then how do I then put the other pieces together once I have that in place? I suspect that's one of the primary trajectories that will discover fruitfulness, in which we're attempting to try and enact.
I just want to remind those who are listening and watching, if you'd like to offer a comment or a suggestion or a question, feel free to come on into the chat room, and we'll try to bring those in. Brett, I'm just thinking, this is just, because as I said, across both waters, we're dealing with some of these same things, and so we want to address. Oh, we have a question that's coming in from the chat room. So let me ask this, Brett. Are you reaching the indigenous people, and what are your approaches to discipleship or forms of church ecclesiology? Is it different for them? Are you reaching the indigenous people? That's a question coming in from our chat room. So,
yeah, and it's a question that there's a lot of history behind that question. One of the things that distinguishes New Zealand from many of the other British colonies is that Christianity was an invited faith. So the early missionaries actually had an invitation from some of the Māori iwi. And it's difficult to think of New Zealand as one country with one tribe. There were very many, we call them iwi, which is essentially tribes. So it was an invited faith. And the early acceptance of Christianity by Māori was quite profound, and significant parts of New Zealand were then evangelized by Māori missionaries. So in the period from 1815 through to maybe 1850, significant evangelism happening, and there's this whole story of Māori evangelizing Māori, and really amazing. But a lot of that story has been lost, because in the next generation, the settler church identified very strongly with the colonizing interests from England, which by then had lost a significant part of the initial motivation that the British missionaries had brought with them, which was really to try and protect as well as evangelize. So there's an interesting ambiguity, dichotomy in New Zealand as to where do Māori and Christianity stand? Do they stand with that first story, where they owned and accepted and embraced Christianity, or do they sit with the second story, where the church actually betrayed them? And that's an ongoing issue for us. And I think every church, and churches like us who have Wesleyan history, and Wesleyan missionaries who are some of the first here from Britain, we actually have to take that quite seriously as a justice issue. So there's that, sits there as part of the story. The other big issue is is we have a significant amount of urbanization. So Maori populations that were primarily provincial and rural, there remain significant provincial rural populations who still retain strong attachment to their local marae or village, and would still continue to do life very much as a community, versus those who are now living in the cities and have varying degrees of ongoing connection to family. Some who would have virtually none, and there is intermarriage and a certain loss of cultural identity. Others who continue to hold on to it or have rediscovered it. So when it comes to thinking about our churches, many of our churches are reaching Māori people who are in the urban centres, who are in varying places on where they culturally identify. For us, what it looks like in a national church is we're comfortable, for example, using te reo, which is the Māori spoken language. We'll use that in worship, in songs. There are songs that are written in Māori. But I would say we're still on that journey, and different communities have different, in the urban areas anyway, have different demographic breakdowns as well. So one of the challenges for us is, are our churches reflecting the demography around them, including that part of the Māori population? Yeah, I don't know if I've answered the question, but it's a reasonably complicated issue,
Sounds like
and one that I think is not easily answered, and one that we're aware of.
And Brett, as you were talking, you talked about justice issues and the wrongs of the church. And here in the United States, one of the things that really makes multi-ethnic ministry difficult is the injustice and inequality of our past and of our present. And so can you talk about the dynamics there? You mentioned that injustice issue there, but what is it like in New Zealand? What kind of injustice and inequality issues do you face, and how does the church deal with it?
And I think, history is so important when it comes to all of this. See, we don't have a slavery history. Just by nature of when New Zealand was settled, that's on the other side of Wilberforce and that dynamic, which led to at least that being no longer seen as something that the state should be supporting, and so. That changes the dynamic significantly. But what we did do was significant land confiscations, significant war that occurred around those land confiscations, and the role of the church changed from being, in the early days, really midwifed a treaty that was signed between Māori tribes and the British Crown, where you would say the church acted really honourably to help enact a covenant that would protect everybody, to in later times where the church became sort of known as the settler church, and therefore identified more strongly with settler interests, and became more of a civilizing and colonizing force, which wasn't great. One of the things that plays out with in New Zealand is significant work needed around land confiscations. And this is where the Wesleyan Church has both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is we have no land, because we're such a new movement. We don't have any land. The curse is we don't have any land. So for us personally, there isn't that issue to deal with in a personal sense. I always think there's a responsibility to continue to speak into that and call all parties to actually act justly. But for us, that's not an issue that we have direct relationship with. Now, the Methodist Church in New Zealand, which is another Methodist denomination, has significant land, and they've had to wrestle with it quite substantially. In terms of the ongoing, Māori is still overrepresented in all of the negative statistics that our country tracks. And while I think there's improvement there, there's still significant room for the country to grow, and for the church to continue to call government to honour its obligations under the treaty, which is really, I think, where the church should be calling upon the parties to honour its obligations. That's speaking truth to power in that sense.
Brett, I'm just wondering, you mentioned that you didn't have slavery per se, but with all of the people who are immigrating in and the people who were already there, do you have like racial tensions like as we do here in the States, or is it kind of flavored differently there in New Zealand?
It is flavored differently. I think it's human nature to fear what you don't know. So it wouldn't be true to say that New Zealand does not have uh, a level of racial intolerance. Um, but I wouldn't say that it's anything like what I've seen when I've been in the States, or what we see, on the truthful medium of television and internet. Um, we certainly don't have the same historical drivers that you do. I think what we have is a sense of um, uh, fear of the stranger. I think there are some people in some parts of New Zealand, particularly in Auckland, who are concerned at the level of immigration, but it manifests itself in issues more like our land prices are going up in Auckland because immigration is driving a scarcity of houses. Um, the Chinese are buying all our land. Those kind of jingoistic sort of statements that I think are more like what we would get. And there's always that those shallow stereotypes that I think sit within. Often that's a generational thing. There are stereotypical viewpoints that you sometimes hear, but even reflecting on what you would hear 20 years ago versus what you hear today, quite different. And some things that were acceptable to say as a joke 20 years ago, you wouldn't say them now. They're just not acceptable. So I think that we're maturing, and but not everyone is on board with a globalization, reality. But we certainly don't have the polarization on that issue that seems to be present in the US, and it does make a difference. We're not starting with strong mistrust. We're more starting with, I don't know you. So how do I get to know you?
And in that immigration conversation, is the church playing an active role in participating in the conversation? What is the stance of the church?
Well, part of the problem that you have is you have very leaky borders. We're surrounded by ocean. It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to immigrate to New Zealand illegally. so I certainly am aware of the wider conversation, and very relevant for people right now. We don't have anything like those kind of issues. So for us, immigration itself is not really a justice issue. I think we have the same tension around refugees. Should refugees come in? Should they not? But by and large, we're happy to welcome refugees. We see that as part of our mandate, and the church would support that. It's not one of our issues in quite the same way that it is for your context. Yeah. The main immigration we have is people overstaying their visas when they come from the Pacific Islands to see family. so the overstayer is the sort of the pariah, rather than your situation.
Brett, what are the things that are pressing upon the Wesleyan Methodist Church there? I mean, if it's not immigration or per se the same sort of racial tension, what is it that presses against the church? What's pressing against the church there?
So one of the factors is the increasing secularism, and that manifests itself in a couple of ways. One part of that is that the church is having to navigate the primacy of its place in society. So we have certain British constitutional assumptions that, to some extent, reflect a period in Christendom where the church was the state church in England. And while we've never had a state church here, things like the Parliament, when it sits, when it opens its session, will have a prayer. And to what extent is that accepted or not accepted? We've had recent significant change in our marriage legislation. where same-sex marriage is now legally permitted by the state, and that then creates tension for the church as to where it fits within the civil aspect of being marriage celebrants. So there are issues like that sit in the socio-political cultural landscape that the church has to decide where it sits on that. And we've had to be a part of navigating that. On the other side of it is so with Pacific cultures, many of them bring with them significant Christian inheritance. If anything, the obstacle they have to overcome is cultural Christianity and a genuine conversion to Christ. I'd almost rather have that problem than the problem, say, of reaching those people of European background who often have no faith inheritance. And then 1, 2, 3 generations where there's no church inheritance. And so in terms of evangelism, let alone the discipling trajectory of all of that, those people, are difficult to bring to Christ. There are not even necessarily any theistic convictions, let alone any particular Christian convictions. So I think that's a very difficult part of the evangelism landscape. And then in terms of the discipling activity that happens with those people, oftentimes you've got, say, 3 generations of disconnection from any sense of faith. So you sometimes hear people say, you know the story of Adam and Eve. Well, in my church, no, half of them don't know that story. You would never say that. Yeah, I've seen an advertisement that has Adam and Eve in it, and there was that movie, with Jack Black in it that had Adam and Eve in it. It's that sort of, that sort of recollection. So that the stories of Scripture are not default cultural markers that you can engage. So the journey of discipleship has to start well back. So I think reaching those people and discipling those communities, that's a challenge. And then we have significant immigration where people are coming with other faith systems, and so how are they reached is a part of the church's dilemma. So it's more reaching the understanding and the diversity of what the evangelistic context is, and that they each have different discipleship responses as well.
Brett, in our history, I think the American church, and I think even before then, we sometimes get confused between discipling Christians and discipling people into Americans. Particularly, we like making white English-speaking Americans. You talk about secular and multi-ethnic coming into the church. How do you walk that line where you are seeking to discover that transformation you talked about, but really seeking to create Christ followers, not culturally similar people? What's the process there, and how do you walk that line?
Well, I think one thing that is different for us than has been the case for you, although I think increasingly this is changing for you, is we don't have a significant inheritance of Christian New Zealand. And I think that makes a difference. I think Christians here feel like the minority. We don't feel like the majority who are being displaced. We feel like the minority already. When we're in First Peter terms, we feel like aliens and exiles here. We don't feel like we're part of the majority that's losing traction in society. So that changes things for a start. We don't. I think there's a tension within American Christianity, if I may observe from the outside, that some of holding on to what has been is what is driving some of this cultural Christianity. It's hard to separate the two. We're losing who we are. And that's faith and that's culture and a whole lot of things that I promised myself I wouldn't talk about in this interview.
Sorry.
And so we don't have that for a start. But I do think, for us, one of the most profound issues is in this third culture issue, where, see, in broad terms, you can either segregate and you can say mono-ethnic churches from churches of origin is how we will navigate this. Well, that'll work well for the first generation. Your monoethnic immigrant church is very missional in the first generation, but completely inappropriate, and certainly by the third generation, for a majority of people who lose language, who and increasingly are out of step with culture. Or you can assimilate and you can say, well, look, we'll just do church this way. And sadly, in New Zealand, often what it looks like is Hillsong. Now, we think of Australia like Canadians think of the US. So just take that picture for a moment. And so for us to be culturally in debt to Australia is really quite a tragedy for our own national sense of confidence. But yet that's a lot of our churches are doing is doing Hillsong out of Australia, and they invite everybody else into that. So you've got your assimilation and your segregation, and really, I think what the possibility and challenge for us is, faced with this huge multi-ethnic, multicultural mission field, and then with the great gift of these young Christians who are third culture, whose parents have brought them up to love Jesus. What is it going to look like for us to see those third culture kids as missionaries to our third culture society? And assimilation isn't going to do it, and segregation isn't going to do it. It's going to require something new, where identity is really integrated around who Christ says we are. Now, one of my friends who I'd hoped would be able to be a part of this, but he's unable to be, but he's one of our multicultural church pastors. And one of the things that he talks about in this area is, one of the key things that you can help people understand is, what is the church? Because whether people have a faith background or not, they bring all kinds of cultural assumptions about what church is and what it isn't. So one of the things that he does is he provides really strong teaching on what is the church. What is the culture of the church? What does it mean to be a body? How do we critique some of the institutions of what we think of as church against that? Can we be clear? That's culture. That's a cultural institution. It's not bad, but nor was it handed down with the Ten Commandments. And so can we critique that? Are there new ways we can do things? For example, he has to deal with multiple different traditions around what happens at a wedding or a funeral, and the church's role in that, which can be massive, can be incredibly taxing on the church. And what is the church going to say? How is the church going to navigate that? Is it going to become an expert in every culture? Or is it going to try to integrate some commonality and say, as a church, this is how we respond? I don't know if that's helpful, but I think those, I think, are the three sort of, again, I'm oversimplifying, but we have, in order for us to try to draw some principles that allow us to act, I think we need some level of clarity about what the context is. And, it's going to be difficult, I think, for some of our monoethnic churches to grasp the possibility that their kids will be missionaries to the third culture community that they live in.
Yeah, and from your perspective, I think it might be real helpful for us if you have some words of advice. You obviously have some understanding of our history and that idea of needing to hold on to our culture, and like we're losing ground, we're losing power, we're losing our place here.
I'm in a cross-cultural marriage. My wife is from it's a very strange place. You might know, it's called Michigan. And
weird.
She's from there. Yeah, I, as part of coming into the Wesleyan Church, I needed to do a dynastic marriage as a part of sealing the relationship. So fortunately, we found love. But yeah. So I have spent a little bit of time there, and I planted a church. I helped plant a church in the US.
Oh, fantastic!
So I was part of the team.
So with some understanding, but also being kind of set apart from us. Do you have any outside perspective for us with the understanding you have as well about how to not take offense and how to not be in that position of trying to maintain our position?
I think I don't personally think that you can underestimate the level of healing and reconciliation that needs to happen, um, and that injustice has to be acknowledged. And one of the things that frustrates me that I see in some commentators is the idea that dealing with injustice, that recognizing that that things have happened and continue to happen that need to be remedied, that itself is a divisive action. And I find that incredibly frustrating. It's a straw man. It's not true. It's not divisive to recognize that a brother or sister has been hurt. And I think that that's an issue of the heart that frustrates me profoundly, because I think it's a part of this holding on. And you're not going to lose anything by acknowledging that somebody has been hurt.
Yep.
In fact, you're going to gain something incredible. So I do think that the church has to continue to call for that, to be a part of that. But like any countercultural message, nor is it the right way to simply slam people between the eyes with this stuff. I think we have to disciple people into an understanding of what justice looks like. There are people in my community who struggle with certain aspects of immigration because they've only ever known one way, one particular worldview, one particular paradigm. And we don't change our paradigms overnight. So I think, as much as I would encourage those that maybe resent the idea that reconciliation needs to precede genuine multicultural engagement, at the same time, those that long for that engagement need to understand that reconciliation is both sides coming to a fresh understanding. And I know it's more complex than sides, but how we disciple people into a stronger understanding of what biblical justice looks like. And because biblical justice at the end of the day is wholeness. That's what justice looks like. It looks like wholeness. And in order for us to get to there, we have to acknowledge that there is a level of unwholeness that needs to be dealt with. And but the goal is wholeness. The goal is not guilt or shame or none of those things. So that would be where I sit on it. It's an issue of the heart. I think it's incredibly difficult. I don't, you'd have solved, if it was easy to solve, someone would have solved it. But yeah, that would be my advice.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. In my recent journey, 3 months into moving into Indiana, a lot of the racial tension that I've experienced, I expected from our long past, but have found it's not that long ago, and it's present now. And I agree with you. I hear more of people bemoaning, and we cry together for the unity of the church and for races to be able to come together. But there is quickly someone who says there is reasons why we're not coming together, and there's lack of trust because things have happened. And I can't agree with you more that unless we're willing to address those and be willing to, particularly the majority culture, be able to humbly address what has been able to happen and hear the wrongs that have happened and are happening, then we're never going to find healing, wholeness, and the racial reconciliation of the church.
And one of the resources, I was thinking as you brought that up, Dan, one of the resources we have, Reverend Sante Speedy, who's our director of Multiethnic Ministries, is advocating a book called Multiethnic Conversations, and it's for the faith community, and it's enabling these conversations to get started in many of our churches and in small groups. And it's just a tremendous resource, because if we don't talk about this, if we never address this, then it can't be healed. And that whole sense, I love what you said, Brett, when you talked about the goal being wholeness. And that's just such a wonderful way to frame that. It's been such a rich conversation. It's hard to believe, but our time is kind of coming to an end. I wanted to thank you, Brett. We wanted to have this because both sides of the water, we're trying to walk through this whole journey of bringing people together and of acknowledging that as we do discipleship, that we have to ask questions and be mindful if we're going cross culture. So I want to give you just a moment, if there are just some little nuggets from the journey in New Zealand of wisdom from what you've learned in your journey. Just if you want to just toss out just a few things that have been helpful, say, hey, here's a nugget as we get ready to bring our conversation to a close.
Well, it wouldn't be a Wesleyan discussion if I didn't mention small groups, and I think that's a lost inheritance for many parts of the church, not just in New Zealand. We've probably managed to maintain that at a relatively high level. I'm aware of research in Australia which suggests that the Wesleyan small group has been lost somewhat. Alan Hirsch has recently written on movement killers, and one of the things that he identifies as a movement killer in the US is the loss of genuine small group ministry. And so I think small groups that are premised on the idea that I am accepted, that there is a place of radical acceptance, small groups that at the same time offer high authenticity. They're places where I can be honest, but the specifically Wesleyan part of that, where there's a strong accountability focus. That was the strength of the Wesleyan movement. And I think for all of us, whatever our cultural defaults, working towards those kind of small group interactions, that's something that we're really putting energy into here. It's certainly my conviction that those weekly pockets of community, whether it's 2 people or 12 people, meeting together, knowing that it's a safe space to honestly process the struggles and the victories of my life with Christ, and knowing that there's a group that are praying for me, that are going to ask me next week about this or that are going to celebrate with me when something goes well, are going to grieve with me and mourn with me when life takes a downward turn. Those were the engine of the Wesleyan revival. And they, I believe, can be a part of how we continue to revive the church in our time.
If I'm not mistaken, your national superintendent, Dr. Wall, did some work in this area?
Yeah, so Richard completed his doctor of ministry at Asbury Theological Seminary, and just trying to get my mouse to move without destroying this this thing. And as part of that, he did some work on areas of Wesleyan DNA that he thinks, based on just the way that over the time of since Wesley's time, what he said, but also what people have picked up on, what might be some critical elements of Wesleyan DNA, particularly relevant for us, where we have a church setting where, in some cases, people are 1, 2, 3 generations from discipleship. What does it look like for us to really own our own Wesleyan identity? And so I just took a risk and I clicked the button. I hope I didn't destroy anything. So the 5 areas that he's identified are the idea of Creator's mission, Missio Dei, having a clear understanding about that, the preeminence of salvation at the kind of the sharp end of what it looks like for the church to engage with its community, a commitment to transformation rather than some of the other things that we maybe put in place. And I've certainly mentioned information and performance as being substitutes that we, in our time and in times gone by, are often substituted. A real emphasis on the means of grace. So what does it look like for us to be a sacramental church in terms of baptism and communion, being more at the heart of the church, but also the wider means of grace that Wesley would often talk about, even things like conferencing, which we're doing this weekend as a national movement. And really the final piece that Richard identified was the call for ministry with the poor. That's something that we need to take seriously. And the preposition is there on purpose. It's not to the poor, it's ministry with the poor. What does it look like for us, however we define that word poor, to be with the least of these? So those were the 5 areas that he's identified, and he's looking at putting a curriculum together that will eventually be available. And I'm sure, because he's a very wise, smart man, I'm sure it will be available in the US as well.
Well, we look forward to that. Brett, I just want to thank you for this conversation and for helping us to understand a little bit of the journey for the churches there in New Zealand and some of the things that kind of cross the waters that help us to think also. So thank you so much for being with us today. Dan, I want to thank you for sitting in, and all of those who are listening and watching. We're really grateful for your participation. You know, I want to invite you, if you want to just continue to think about cross-cultural experiences, I want to give one last plug to our discipleship cruise. Registration ends on the 15th of November, but you can put down a $250 deposit and still be able to go with us. We're going to be diving deep into issues of discipleship, including what it means to do that across cultures. What does it mean to be relational across cultures? So you can go to our website and find that. Thank you so much for tuning in today as we've talked about discipleship in a multi-ethnic context. And we just pray God's blessing as you continue your journey.